Something moves when you observe, an almost invisible deviation in the course of events. A gaze rests upon the world, and suddenly the world seems to breathe differently. The boundary between what happens by chance and what happens because of you dissolves. Science tries to measure this phenomenon in quantum laboratories. The ancient seekers recognized it as the moment when consciousness touches matter. Imagine that each time you contemplate something, a face, a memory, a doubt, a silent field reorganizes itself. It's not imagination, it's response. Observation is not a mirror, it is a guiding force. The universe, sensitive to your focus, begins to adjust its own architecture around what you choose to see. Perhaps the power of creation has never been in words or actions, but in that instant of pure attention, when the invisible decides to become real. Everything changes the instant the gaze becomes conscious. Reality, which once seemed solid, reveals itself as malleable, almost liquid. There is a subtle threshold, difficult to identify, where observation ceases to be an automatic function of the senses and becomes a living, creative presence. In that moment, the observer not only records the world, he reconfigures it. It is as if a hidden lens adjusts within you, and suddenly the fabric of reality responds to your focus. Modern science stumbled upon this mystery while studying the behavior of subatomic particles. The so-called double-slit experiment revealed something disturbing. Matter behaves differently when it is observed. The electron, which should follow a predictable pattern, seems to hesitate before the human gaze, as if waiting for instruction. It becomes a wave or a particle depending on whether or not it is observed. Observation, something seemingly passive, interferes with the outcome of the experiment. This phenomenon, though described in scientific language, echoes what ancient yogis and hermetic philosophers had long claimed. Consciousness is a force that shapes experience. But this idea does not belong only to laboratories. It manifests silently in daily life. Observe a simple situation. When someone feels truly seen, something changes in their posture. The attentive gaze has the power to dissolve emotional armor. The person begins to reorganize themselves according to the attention they receive. The same happens with the environment, with circumstances, with one's own thoughts. When you observe a fear without judging it, it transforms. When you observe an idea, it gains structure. When you observe a desire, it begins to find its path. That moment of conscious observation is like lighting a torch in a dark room. The shadows do not disappear through an effort to expel them, but simply because the light of perception makes them understandable. The mind, once scattered, gathers into a point of clarity. The simple act of observing dissolves fragmentation and restores to reality its original fluidity. Nothing needs to be forced. Change happens because consciousness, upon touching something, realigns it with the principle of harmony that exists in all forms of life. The Zen masters called this seeing without choosing, observing without wishing to modify, without wishing to confirm anything, simply seeing. This neutrality is not coldness, but power. It is in this state that the world begins to reveal its hidden patterns. Everything you call coincidence, chance, or synchronicity arises from this field, where observation becomes a guiding energy. When you observe with presence, events begin to fold around that presence as if recognizing an invisible gravitational center. Life, at that point, ceases to be a sequence of disconnected events and begins to behave like a continuous conversation between you and the whole. With every conscious gaze, you send out a vibrational message, and the response comes in the form of circumstances, intuitions, encounters. Observation is a language, and you speak it all the time, even unconsciously. When you learn to listen to it, you realize that nothing is completely random. Everything that appears before your eyes carries within it information about your own inner state. There is a simple experience that can make this principle tangible. Sit for a few moments in silence, without trying to control anything. Choose an object in front of you, a flame, a stone, a leaf, and simply observe. Allow your gaze to rest, without expectation. Gradually, something changes. Perception expands, and the object seems to acquire a kind of vitality, a clearer presence. Time slows down. You are not just seeing something, you are being seen as well. The boundary between observer and observed begins to dissolve, revealing a silent unity that has always been there. This simple practice, repeated, has the power to change the way you move through the world. Situations cease to be confronted and begin to be witnessed. Tension gives way to clarity. When the gaze is steady, reactions lose strength, and life begins to organize itself around that stability. It is an invisible but decisive turning point, the passage from unconscious action to conscious observation. And paradoxically, the more you observe, the more external circumstances transform, as if reality bends to the field of your attention. Perhaps the power of observation does not lie in changing the world, but in revealing what has always been hidden beneath the noise of distraction. Transformation does not come from the outside. It arises from a change in the quality of the gaze. Life then begins to behave like a mirror, sensitive to the consciousness that contemplates it. Each gesture, each encounter, each obstacle reorganizes itself around the vibration of the awakened observer. The moment you truly see is the same moment when everything begins to change, not because something new has been created, but because the invisible has finally been noticed. The world rarely shouts its truths, it whispers. And most of those whispers are lost in the constant noise of the mind that runs, compares, anticipates. The ordinary gaze sees only what it already expects to find. Silent attention, however, penetrates beyond the surface and begins to reveal the invisible territory where causes take shape before becoming effects. It is in that silence that the hidden lines of reality start to become perceptible, not because something new appears, but because the noise that covered the essential finally dissipates. When the mind becomes quiet, the perceptive field expands. The sound of the wind takes on a deeper texture, the body feels more present, and life, which once seemed to happen outside you, begins to pulse within. This is the difference between the distracted gaze and the awakened gaze. The first moves over forms, the second merges with them. Silent attention does not seek to understand or name, but to witness. And within that, witnessing lies an ancient wisdom, to perceive without interfering. Imagine reality as a vast ocean, and each of your thoughts is a wave. The common mind, agitated, sees only the surface movement of the waves, believing that they are all that exists. But when you dive into silent attention, you perceive the immensity of stillness that sustains every wave. Perception shifts from the noise to the base that generates it. And that is when the invisible begins to become visible. What once seemed like chance reveals itself as pattern. What seemed like chaos shows itself as dance. Silent attention has the ability to illuminate without force. It does not question the world. It listens to it. When that listening becomes deep, even the most trivial events begin to carry a sense of message, a delay, a phrase spoken by chance, an object forgotten along the way. Everything seems to speak, as if life had its own code that can only be deciphered by those who observe in silence. There is no superstition in this. There is attunement. The more refined the focus, the more legible the universe becomes. What we call intuition is not a mystical gift, but the direct result of this sharpened attention. The mind, freed from noise, begins to capture micro-perceptions that would normally be ignored. The body also participates in this listening. Goosebumps, pulsations, subtle changes in breathing become signs of a dialogue that has always existed between you and the surrounding field. It is as if the world were constantly sending out answers, but you only hear them when the inner noise ceases. In the ancient schools of contemplation, there was a simple exercise: to remain before an empty space until something within oneself moved. The disciples were instructed to look not at what was there, but at the very act of looking. The master would say that true seeing is born when the observer dissolves into the observed. Silence then ceases to be the absence of sound and becomes pure presence. And in that state, the invisible reveals itself, not as something new, but as what had always existed at the edge of ordinary perception. You can experience this now, directly. Close your eyes for a few moments and perceive the ambient sound. Do not try to identify the sources, simply feel the sound field. Notice how there are layers: the distant sound, the closer one, the almost inaudible. In a few seconds, something curious happens. the sense of separation diminishes. You are no longer hearing sounds, you are being traversed by vibrations. This fusion is the point where silent attention begins to reveal what once went unnoticed. The fact that the world was never outside, only existing in different densities of perception. Silent attention is not a mystical state reserved for monks. It is a natural return to the mind's original condition. When you allow yourself to remain present without expectation, you begin to notice small changes in the texture of moments. Someone's gaze carries intentions that previously would have gone unnoticed. A place communicates its mood. A thought that seemed confused organizes itself. Life responds because it finally finds space to manifest. Consciousness becomes receptive and reality malleable. This form of attention also dissolves judgment. When you observe without naming, the experience ceases to be divided into good or bad, right or wrong. And paradoxically, by freeing yourself from these categories, clarity increases. You begin to see the subtlest movements of the ego, the patterns that repeat behaviors, the resistances that distort perception. The simple act of seeing all this, without trying to correct it, initiates a profound transformation. Consciousness, by illuminating what was hidden, naturally reorganizes the field. There is beauty in perceiving the world in this way. The small things, the vibration of a leaf, the pause between words, the sound of a distant clock, begin to carry meanings that language cannot contain. Life reveals its symbolic structure, as if every detail were part of a greater score that you are only now beginning to hear. And the most surprising thing is that this listening changes the very course of events. By noticing what once went unnoticed, you alter the way the universe organizes itself around you. Silent attention is the portal between the visible and the invisible, between what happens and what could happen. As you move in this state, you discover that nothing is too small to contain the whole. What was once noise becomes message. What was mundane reveals itself as sacred. The world does not change, it is the gaze that finally learns to see. Looking is a reflex, seeing is an act. Between one and the other lies an abyss that separates habit from consciousness. Looking only gathers forms, seeing reveals meanings. Looking touches the surface of things, seeing penetrates the silence that sustains them. Most people spend their lives looking, rarely seeing, because seeing requires presence, and presence cannot coexist with automatism. Seeing is a gesture that consumes the false and unmasks the real. From childhood, we are trained to look in order to recognize, identify, classify. Looking became a survival tool. But there is a moment when this pragmatic looking becomes a prison, a way of freezing the mystery in the name of safety. The one who only looks repeats the world. The one who truly sees recreates it. Seeing is an event born at the point where consciousness surpasses the need to name. The object is no longer a this or a that, but a living presence that reveals itself entirely. The ancient Taoists describe this difference as the passage from looking with the eyes to seeing with the heart. The first depends on external light, the second is born from inner light. Ordinary looking needs something outside in order to exist. True seeing emanates from within and illuminates what it touches. When you truly see, you are no longer a subject looking at an object. You are the very act of vision happening. Everything dissolves in that instant, including the eye that was observing. Ordinary looking is restless. It searches, compares, desires. It is always seeking something to confirm or deny. Seeing, on the other hand, is motionless. It does not seek. It simply recognizes what is already present. It is the gaze of the wise person who contemplates a stone and sees in it the same movement that exists in the stars. It is the gaze of the artist who perceives eternity condensed in a banal moment. It is the gaze of the scientist who, by staring at a phenomenon with total surrender, discovers invisible laws. Authentic seeing does not distinguish art, science, or spirituality, because all are born from the same point, awakened consciousness. To truly see implies a risk, that of no longer being able to feign ignorance. When something is seen clearly, the mask falls, justifications become fragile, roles dissolve, and the real naked presents itself. This is why many prefer to continue only looking, because seeing demands responsibility. What is seen can no longer be denied, and the simple act of recognizing a truth transforms it. There is a simple yet powerful example. Think of a person you believe you know well. You look at them and see a set of memories, predictable gestures, familiar traits. But if, for a moment, you suspend everything you believe you know and simply allow yourself to see, something different happens. The face seems to change. A vibration reveals itself. A field pulses behind the expressions. That person, previously limited to your mental image, becomes a living being in constant birth. That is seeing, allowing the other and the world to reinvent themselves before your gaze. In physics, there is a concept called the internal observer, the idea that every measurement alters the phenomenon observed. Similarly, in consciousness, ordinary-looking measures evaluates, restricts. Seeing liberates, it does not measure, it welcomes. And what is welcomed transforms. The difference between looking and seeing lies in the quality of attention. Looking consumes energy. Seeing generates it. Looking tries to understand. Seeing recognizes. Looking analyzes the world. Seeing participates in it. You can experience this difference now. Choose something before you, a flame, a photograph, any object, and look for a few moments. Let your gaze stabilize. Then soften it. Stop trying to understand what you see. Simply be present, breathing. Gradually you will notice a change. The object seems to gain density, as if it began to radiate something back. At that point, you are no longer looking. You are seeing. Separation disappears, and the instant becomes a space of silent communion. This way of seeing has profound implications in everyday life. When you truly see a situation, instead of merely reacting to it, something inside reorganizes. Conflict loses strength, anxiety dissolves. Clear vision is therapeutic by nature. It unties knots without effort. It is as if the light of seeing dissolved the shadows of deception. The world around you may remain the same, but your relationship with it changes radically. What once seemed like an obstacle reveals itself as a teacher. What once seemed routine becomes revelation. Seeing is the true beginning of transformation. No technique, philosophy, or belief replaces the direct impact of clear perception. When you see, the mind grows quiet out of respect. It is as if existence, touched by your awakened gaze, responded with an invisible reverence. The universe recognizes when it is seen, and in that recognition everything begins to align. At bottom, the difference between looking and truly seeing is the difference between existing and being alive. Looking travels over the world, seeing inhabits it. Looking separates, seeing unifies. Looking leans on memory, seeing springs from the now. And when you learn to see, the entire world changes texture, not because something new has arisen, but because you are finally present enough to perceive what has always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Presence is the point where time bends. When you are truly present, the past loses the power to repeat itself, and the future ceases to be an automatic reflection of fear or desire. In this state, something different begins to act through you, a silent intelligence that reorganizes the course of events. Presence is not an attitude, it is a frequency. And when that frequency stabilizes, the world around you begins to respond in unexpected ways. It is easy to confuse presence with attention. Attention is a direction of the gaze. Presence is the field that sustains that gaze. You can be attentive to something and still absent, trapped in inner interpretations that distort the real. Presence, on the contrary, dissolves the interpreter. It is the instant in which observer and observed become a single vibration. At that point, you do not merely perceive the world, you influence it, even without intention. Neuroscience shows that states of full attention alter the brain's electrical rhythm, reorganizing patterns of perception and response. But something deeper happens beyond neural circuits. Presence modifies the body's vibrational field, the way it emits and receives information. Present people seem to alter the environment without saying a word. Where they are, time slows down, communication becomes more authentic. Results adjust with mysterious precision. It is not charisma, it is coherence. Presence is vibrational coherence between what you think, feel, and manifest. Imagine a conductor before an orchestra. If he becomes dispersed even slightly, the ensemble loses synchronicity. But when he anchors himself in the instant, every gesture, however minimal, reorders the collective sound. So it is with life. It responds to the degree of presence that conducts it. Chaos is not a mistake of the universe. It is merely the music played by a distracted conductor. When presence returns, chaos reorganizes, and what once seemed like chance reveals itself as harmony. There are people who enter a room and seem to bring a silence with them. That silence is not the absence of sound, but density of being. It is as if space bent slightly, recognizing a more integral vibration. All the great transformers in history shared this quality. It was not what they did that produced impact, but the state of presence that sustained their actions. A simple gesture, when emanating from that point, has more power than 1,000 calculated strategies. Presence is also an antidote to fear. Fear lives in time, in what was and what may be. But in the absolute now, fear finds no dwelling. It needs memory or projection to exist. When consciousness anchors itself in the present, fear dissolves like mist in the sun. And without the noise of fear, perception expands. What once was a threat reveals itself as the natural movement of life. This is the subtle power of presence. It transforms reaction into response, impulse into wisdom. Practicing presence is, in fact, allowing yourself to be seen by life itself. You do not try to control, you simply witness. And in witnessing, something within you begins to align with the intelligence that permeates everything. Small coincidences arise, the right words appear at the exact moment, paths open without effort. It is as if the universe were a vast organism that recognizes those who are awake within it. There is an exercise that helps make this experience tangible. In any situation, a conversation, a task, a walk, bring your attention to the point where your body touches the ground. Feel the gravity, the contact, the weight. Breathe and allow this sense of presence to spread through your entire body. Now perceive the surrounding environment without trying to analyze it. Simply feel the shared field. If you remain like this for a few seconds, something changes. People seem to respond differently. The environment gains sharpness. Time expands. That expansion is the sign that presence has settled. Presence has the power to rewrite what seemed like fate. It does not interfere with events by force, but repositions them by resonance. When you are present, you stop reacting from the residues of the past and begin to act from the intelligence of the instant. Choices become more precise, words more fitting, gestures more authentic. The external world reflects this precision as growing synchrony. What once felt like effort becomes flow. The ancients called this state the center of the circle. It is the motionless point around which everything turns. Remaining at this center is living in a state of presence. Time may continue to run, challenges may arise, but something in you does not move. And from this stillness is born a power that does not need to be displayed, the power to influence reality simply by being. In the end, the secret of presence is simple, but requires surrender. It cannot be achieved by technique, only recognized. It is already there beneath the noise of memories and expectations. When you stop seeking, it reveals itself, and once revealed, the world begins to align with your vibration, as if recognizing a silent command coming from the very center of existence. The course of events changes not because you impose a new direction, but because presence causes everything to reorder naturally around a clearer axis. Life, at last, becomes a dance in sync with the now, the only place where the real truly happens. At a certain point in the journey, something changes silently. Observation ceases to be a simple act of the mind and becomes a form of dialogue with the universe itself. Life begins to respond to your gaze, as if it recognized in it an ancient affinity. Every event seems to contain a coded message, and the world, once opaque, reveals a kind of secret grammar. This language is not made of words, but of subtle correspondences, of signs, of vibrations that are reflected in everything. When you learn to listen to it, you realize you are never separate from what surrounds you. The universe has always spoken to you. It was only waiting for you to learn to listen, At first, the mind doubts. It attributes what happens to chance, to coincidence. But chance, when observed with presence, repeats too many patterns to be mere accident. A phrase overheard by chance answers a question you kept in silence. A person appears at the exact moment you needed clarity. An obstacle becomes an invitation. Everything begins to align as if the world were a mirror sensitive to your inner vibration. At this point, observation is already dialogue. You speak with your gaze and the universe responds with events. Contemporary physics describes something similar when speaking of probability fields. The observer not only records the phenomenon, but interferes with it, guiding its manifestation. In the dimension of consciousness, this translates into something more intimate. Focus defines reality. What you observe with involvement expands. What you ignore recedes. Attention is the currency of exchange between you and the field that sustains you. Every time you observe something with presence, the universe understands it as a request. The ancients called this principle the law of return. But the return is neither punishment nor reward. It is response. Life returns what it receives from your consciousness, amplified. That is why to observe is to create. To observe with fear is to sow scarcity. To observe with confidence is to make room for flow. Life's language does not judge, it only reflects. It speaks through synchronicity, sensation, the smallest gesture. And the subtler your gaze, the more direct the response you receive. There are moments when this communication becomes almost palpable. You think of someone and that person sends a message. You dream of a symbol, and the next day it materializes somewhere. The boundary between thought and event dissolves. It is as if life was saying, "I am listening." The attentive observer realizes that everything, absolutely everything, is the expression of an ongoing dialogue. Reality ceases to be a backdrop and reveals itself as a living correspondence, an organism that breathes with you. But for this language to flourish, observation must be pure. A gaze contaminated by the expectation of control interrupts the communication. Life does not speak to those who demand, but to those who listen. It is a language that reveals itself in surrender, not in the attempt to decipher. To observe is therefore an act of intelligent surrender. You open yourself to the unknown and allow it to reveal itself in its own rhythm. This is true spiritual humility, not knowing what will come, but being so present that any answer is sufficient. There is a practice that awakens this listening. Upon waking before any thought, let your gaze rest on something simple. The light coming through the window, the distant sound of the city, the rhythm of your own breathing. Observe without naming. Simply feel that the world is saying something to you, even if you cannot translate it. This attitude changes the vibration of the entire day. Life begins to speak in details, in a stranger's look, in the exact timing of a pause, in the unlikely coincidence. Everything becomes a sign. Everything communicates. Life's language is symbolic, and the symbol is the point where visible reality touches the invisible. Every event, however small, carries a code that only the awakened observer can perceive. When something repeats itself before you, a color, a number, a gesture, it is not chance. It is response. It is not to be interpreted with superstition, but felt with depth. The universe is a subtle teacher. It speaks through repetitions, echoes, resonance. Living in this state is like taking part in an eternal conversation where silence is as eloquent as words. You begin to feel when something is in harmony and when something asks for adjustment. Directions become clearer, not because someone reveals them, but because life's own flow guides you. Observation becomes a compass, a silent prayer, a channel of guidance. You realize that destiny is not a drawn line, but a continuous dialogue between your attention and the intelligence that inhabits all things. When observation becomes language, living ceases to be an effort and becomes an act of listening. You no longer need to control, you only need to understand the signs. Life wants to collaborate with those who truly observe it, because the conscious observer is part of the universe's own mind. At this point, everything that happens, even the unexpected, seems to serve a purpose that only the soul understands. And if you have come this far, it is because this language has already begun to speak within you. Perhaps you have felt it in small coincidences, in intuitions that were confirmed, in moments when life seemed to respond to your gaze. If this makes sense, make a symbolic gesture now. Like this video and write in the comments the phrase, "I am listening to life." It is a way to declare to yourself and to the field that surrounds you that you are ready for this sacred dialogue to continue. When the gaze awakens, the world begins to speak in another language. A language without sounds, without sentences, without explanations. It is a communication made of vibrations, of small coincidences, of gestures that seem innocent but carry meaning. The universe is a constant emitter of signals, and awakened consciousness is the receiver that finally tunes to the correct frequency. What once seemed random begins to have coherence. The boundaries between the internal and the external dissolve. Life, at last, begins to respond. These answers do not arrive in speeches or in spectacular revelations. They insinuate themselves. They are subtle, almost shy, like the movement of water when the wind changes direction. A gaze that meets yours at the right moment. A delay that avoids a meeting that should not happen. A memory that appears out of nowhere and resolves a dilemma that reasoning could not solve. When you are awake, you realize that life guides you all the time, and it does so through details that only presence is capable of capturing. Many call this synchronicity, but the name matters little. What really happens is an adjustment between fields. The external world echoes the internal state, and the internal state attunes the external world. The boundary between cause and effect becomes indistinct. You feel that something, a greater intelligence, an invisible order, responds to your vibration with a precision that the rational mind could not plan. And this perception awakens a new, almost reverential trust. The feeling that you are being guided not by chance but by consonance. This guidance, however, requires listening. Most people want shouted answers, explicit signs, certainties that dispense with sensitivity. But life rarely speaks loudly. It moves in thin layers, in low tones. It takes a listening that does not depend on the ear, an attention that goes beyond logic. The world speaks in symbols because the symbol touches the unconscious, and the unconscious is the ground where the real and the invisible meet. When you understand the symbolic language of experiences, you realize that everything, absolutely everything, is a message. A simple example, imagine that for days the same image repeats itself around you. An animal, a number, a color. To the distracted mind, this is irrelevant. To the awakened gaze, it is correspondence. It is not superstition, but attunement. The universe is like a great self-regulating organism that communicates through resonance. It repeats what needs to be noticed until consciousness recognizes the pattern. Awakening is, in part, this recognition, understanding that life is not happening to you, but with you. The ancients said that the world is an oracle in motion. Nothing is mute. The wind chants silence. Everything speaks. One only needs to learn to listen. The world does not respond to words, but to vibration. It is the quality of your presence that determines the tone of the response. When you vibrate in gratitude, life responds with abundance. When you vibrate in scarcity, it returns absence, not as punishment, but as correspondence. Existence is a quantum mirror, returning to consciousness what it emits. This constant exchange between you and the universe creates a form of intimacy that few recognize. It is a sacred relationship in which questions and answers are not separated by time. Sometimes the answer is already present at the very moment the question is asked, only on a plane still invisible. When you slow down, the answer emerges. It is like watching a photograph develop in an old liquid. The image was always there, but it needed time to appear. So acts the field of life, gradually revealing what your vibration has already created. That is why the awakened do not rush. They know that the universe speaks in the time of precision, not in the time of anxiety. Each event arrives when the observer is ready to understand it. Haste confuses the signs, silence deciphers them. When you learn to wait consciously, the answers come laden with meaning. And that meaning is always expansive. It never limits, never reduces, always broadens the view of the real. There are moments when the world responds so directly that it seems playful. You think about changing direction and, On the same day, someone mentions exactly the path you were considering. You wonder whether to trust a decision, and a symbol appears, a song, a word, a gesture, that confirms the inner impulse. In these moments, the boundary between inside and outside dissolves completely. You realize that the universe is a participatory consciousness that speaks in the language of subtlety and manifests through what you are able to perceive. The one who is awake then understands that prayer is not a request but a deep observation. To pray is to observe with love, and by observing with love, you summon the universe to respond with the same vibration. This dialogue is continuous, and the more you recognize it, the more it intensifies. What was coincidence becomes certainty. What was chance becomes communion. Life ceases to be an enigma and becomes living correspondence. True wisdom lies in keeping this listening active without losing lightness. Because the universe does not demand solemnity, only presence. The answers are always arriving, discreet, like letters left under the door of consciousness. You only need to be awake enough to pick them up. The world around you is a living, sensitive, moldable surface. It reflects with precision the texture of what you vibrate inside. Nothing that happens is entirely external. Everything is an expression, a symbolic translation of your state of consciousness at a given moment. Reality seen up close is like a liquid mirror. It changes shape according to the movement of your presence. When the interior harmonizes, the surrounding circumstances align. When there is internal conflict, the scene becomes disorganized. The universe responds not to words, but to the frequency of what you are. Many spend their lives trying to adjust the world out there without realizing they are merely rearranging reflections. It is like trying to change your own face by altering the mirror. The effort is exhausting because it ignores the origin. Everything that appears as obstacle, repetition, or chaos is born from a point within, a thought pattern, an emotion not understood, a belief not dissolved. Reality does not punish, it only echoes. What is observed with fear tends to multiply. What is observed with clarity tends to resolve. Quantum physics offers a fascinating parallel. The energy field that permeates the universe is sensitive to coherence. Waves in harmony reinforce each other. Waves in conflict cancel each other out. Human consciousness, being also a field, follows the same law. When you vibrate in disorder, alternating between doubt and desire, resistance and attachment, you create interference in the fabric of reality. But when your interior stabilizes, the external world begins to reorganize by resonance. Inner balance translates into synchronicity, fluidity, lightness. It is possible to observe this in small things. On days when you wake up in peace, traffic seems lighter, conversations flow, solutions appear naturally. But when you wake tense or scattered, the world seems to react. Noises, delays, misunderstandings. Nothing has changed outside, only the inner lens. The world is neutral. It is your vibration that colors the experience. This realization, though simple, is revolutionary, because it places the power of transformation exactly where it has always been, within. The inner state is like the climate of being. It precedes events, shapes them, and translates them. Each emotion is a paint that colors perception. Anger distorts time, anxiety speeds it up, serenity expands it. When you are in presence, time seems to open space, as if each instant stretched to fit entirely. Life responds to this expansion by allowing the unexpected to find passage. It is at this point that coincidences increase, opportunities arise, and challenges become learning. The ancient alchemists described this process as the transmutation of lead into gold. Lead is emotional density, the weight of unconscious reactions. Gold is the shine of integrated consciousness. The transformation happens inside, but the whole world witnesses it. When density dissolves, external situations become more transparent. People change their behavior, resistances dissolve, and life's flow begins to run again. Not because you imposed something, but because your inner field stopped sustaining the imbalance that created them. The reflection is so exact that it sometimes seems cruel. Repetitive situations, painful encounters, obstacles that return with new faces. All of these are coded messages. They do not come to punish, but to show the point within you that still asks for light. When something insists on repeating, it is a sign that the lesson has not yet been integrated. Life is pedagogical. It repeats until you see, and it ceases when the seeing is complete. Change is not fighting the reflection, but adjusting the originating vibration. There is a simple way to perceive this dynamic. Observe how you react to what the world shows you. The anger that arises is not caused by the situation, but revealed by it. The fear that appears does not come from outside, but is awakened by the external reflection. When you understand this, you begin to use life as a mirror of self-knowledge. Each event becomes a portal of observation. By looking honestly at what the world reflects, you begin to dissolve what creates it. Reality then adjusts naturally, like water that calms when the whirl that agitated it ceases. This perception changes the way you relate to everything. Instead of seeking culprits or external causes, you begin to investigate the inner field that is in dialogue with what is happening. The question ceases to be, "Why did this happen to me?" and becomes, "What within me is vibrating in tune with this?" This change of focus transforms a victim into a co-creator. The power returns to the hands of the one who observes. When this understanding takes root, a new kind of serenity is born. You realize that the world is not against you, but on your side, even when it seems difficult. Situations do not happen to punish, but to reveal. Each conflict is a chance to see your own reflection more clearly, and each clarity reached changes the texture of the real. Life is a teacher that teaches through the mirror of the instant. Over time, you realize there is no inside and outside, only continuity. The world is the extension of your consciousness, and you are the extension of the world's consciousness. The reflection becomes unity. At this point, observation ceases to be analysis and becomes communion. The universe is no longer a distant landscape. It is your own face returning to you what you still need to recognize. And it is in this recognition that true awakening begins. The instant when you understand that everything you see is only the echo of what you vibrate, and that by changing the inner sound, the echo inevitably transforms. There is a moment when the search ceases, not because you have found all the answers, but because you understand that there was never a someone who needed to find them. Consciousness, which for so long identified itself with thoughts, roles, and stories, suddenly realizes that it is none of these forms. It is the silent space where all of them occur. This is the true awakening, the moment when you recognize yourself as the observer who has always been there, unchanging, witnessing the constant movement of life. For years, perhaps decades, we believed ourselves to be the protagonists of our experiences, the one who suffers, the one who wins, the one who desires, the one who fears. We live immersed in the narrative of the I, trying to adjust the plot of the world to the image we created of ourselves. But there comes a moment when something breaks. A gentle weariness settles in, and a question arises from the depths of being: who is the one that perceives all this? When that question is asked with depth, it does not demand an intellectual answer. It opens a portal. The gaze turns toward itself, and the seeker disappears into what was being sought. What is revealed at that moment is not a new identity, but the absence of identity. You are not the body that changes, nor the mind that thinks, nor the emotions that fluctuate. You are the space in which body, mind, and emotion arise and fade away. You are the stage, not the character. Everything that happens, joys, losses, fears, achievements, appears within you and then dissolves. But the observer remains untouched, silent, ever present. This presence is the axis of reality, the unmoving center around which the world turns. It is natural for the mind to resist this perception. It fears losing its central role, fears dissolving into silence. But when you observe it without struggle, it also grows quiet, like a child who calms under a compassionate gaze. Then what once seemed confusion reveals itself as dance. What seemed suffering becomes learning. What seemed like time shows itself as an unfolding within eternity. You begin to see yourself not as part of the story, but as the field in which all stories are projected. This awakening does not happen in mystical explosions, but in moments of extreme simplicity. It may occur while you walk, breathe, or listen to the sound of rain. Suddenly you realize that you are aware of all of this, and that this awareness is independent of what is perceived. There is a profound serenity in this recognition. It is like waking from a dream without needing to interpret it. The world remains the same, but something essential changes. The center of gravity of experience shifts from the I to being. In this state, life ceases to be a sequence of events to be controlled and becomes a flow to be contemplated. You act, speak, decide, but no longer confuse yourself with the role you play. Emotions continue to arise, but lose the power to drag you along. Thoughts continue to pass, but they are seen as clouds, not as the sky. This lucid distance is not indifference. It is freedom. You begin to live lightly because you no longer believe you are the drama unfolding. The masters of all traditions have tried to point to this same realization, that the essence of the human being is pure consciousness. Jesus called it the kingdom of heaven within. Buddha called it the awakened mind. The Vedic sages called it Atman, different names for the same phenomenon, the recognition that the observer is the very source of reality. When this is perceived, the fear of death disappears, because what is observed is born and dies, but the observer remains untouched. You do not have consciousness, you are consciousness. The mind tries to understand this paradox, but awakening is not something that can be explained, only lived. It is a direct recognition, without intermediaries. And, paradoxically, it is the end of the spiritual search. What was seeking the infinite was the infinite itself, looking at itself through a temporary form. When the veil falls, life goes on, but now with a flavor of eternity in every instant. You continue to play roles, but you now know that all are expressions of the same being. All of existence becomes sacred because everything is seen as part of the same field of consciousness that observes. This perception does not isolate, it integrates. The observer is not separate from the observed, but is the very substance that gives existence to all things. The other, the world, the events, all are expressions of the same presence, now recognizing itself in everything it sees. Then a spontaneous compassion arises, not as virtue but as recognition. To love the other becomes as natural as breathing, because the other is just another form of yourself appearing in the mirror of the world. Awakening, therefore, is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of true life. A life in which fear loses meaning, in which action arises from clarity, and in which silence becomes the foundation of all wisdom. You discover that there was never separation, only the play of consciousness pretending to forget itself so that it could remember again. And when this remembrance becomes steady, everything that exists, sound, body, breath, the movement of time, comes to be recognized as the expression of the same eternal observer that you have always been. Life itself becomes meditation. The world, once seen as scenery, reveals itself as an extension of your own being. And in that instant, the seeker and the sought dissolve into a single gaze, the gaze of existence itself, contemplating itself. Everything you have observed up to this point, the gaze, the silence, the presence, the reflection, pointed to the same center, the one who observes. The entire life is a movement that happens within this consciousness that now awakens to itself. The world no longer needs to be understood or controlled, only recognized as an extension of your own being. When the observer recognizes itself in the observed, time ceases, and the real reveals itself in its totality. The power of observation is not in changing the world, but in remembering that you have always been the space where it happens. If you felt this truth resonate within you, write in the comments, "I am the observer," so I know you made it to the end. And if you wish to continue diving into this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. The journey is only just beginning.